This is Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball discussion, hosted by Inside the Hall founder and editor, Alex Bozich. Since 2007, Inside the Hall has been trusted by IU fans across the globe to be the one-stop shop for IU basketball news, commentary, and analysis. Join us over at InsideTheHall.com. That's InsideTheHall.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Pleased to be joined, as always, by a good friend of the show, Dylan Burkhardt of UMHoops. And originally, Dylan had planned this podcast as a kind of opportunity for us to take a second look at our preseason Big Ten top 25 players list. But instead, Indiana beat Iowa last night in what was a pretty surprising upset. I feel like one of the bigger upsets so far in the Big Ten season, and in a win that really has some implications for Michigan too, because the Wolverines were tied with Iowa in the loss column atop the Big Ten standings. So welcome back to the show, Dylan. Any thoughts on last night's win for the Hoosiers in Iowa City?
Well, first I want to say it's a bold decision to want to revisit our Big Ten top 25 list. I'm not sure it was the best we've ever done, but I don't think we ever do a particularly great job on that list, but it's a fun activity. Indiana, that was quite a performance last night. It's kind of shocking to see Iowa lose because of its offense, right? I think they went without a field goal for almost like 10 minutes or something like that.
It was over 11 minutes.
Yeah, so that's like – it would be one thing we would all expect Iowa to lose in a 98-90 shootout or something like that, but for Indiana to figure out, we can shut them down for that long, that was really impressive, and that kind of is where I think you have to start. And I think Indiana's defense hasn't always been elite this year, but I think you can see that on their good days they can be a good defensive team. So I think that's the baseline you get with this team.
So it's curious you mentioned, or it's interesting that you mentioned them shutting Iowa down. Do you think it was more Iowa just playing poorly, or Indiana actually doing something that was different than what other teams did? You know, the one thing I wrote about kind of going into this game, and in full disclosure, in my preview, I basically said if Indiana can't keep up offensively, there's no chance they're going to win, because that's basically how it's gone all season. Iowa's two previous losses against Gonzaga and Minnesota, those teams basically just had to outscore them to win. This is the first time a team has really kind of slowed them down and shut them down in any way. And I look at the fact that, Garza's going to get his points. He got 28. But Jordan Bohannon basically being a no-show to me was a significant factor in this game. So do you think this game is more about just Jordan Bohannon not making any shots and Iowa going cold, or more that Indiana was able to figure out some ways to slow them down in the second half?
I think it's always a bit of both. I think you have to first look at the problem with Iowa, and I've probably been down on Iowa compared to national perception for a while, but Iowa needs to play an elite offensive game every time out to win because their defense is bad, right? Like Indiana shot 21 of 35 at the free throw line, but still scored 1.19 points per possession. That's about as good as Indiana's offense has been all year, and that's just kind of what Iowa allows. So that's the problem with Iowa, and if you can make them just average to good on offense, well, then you have a chance to win. And you're going to have to get lucky. I think that's the recipe. But I think the key is that you can let Luka Garza get his. I think people get caught up with, we have to stop Luka Garza. Let's double him. Let's do this. Look, Luka Garza can get all of his points, but Iowa runs away with games when their shooters go crazy. So, you have to give credit to Indiana for, Jordan Bohannon obviously is not going to go 0 of 9 every time out. You got a little lucky there. But overall, I think the approach was solid, and that's the way to go about beating Iowa is, all right, we're going to run our stuff, we're going to score, and then we're going to see if Luka Garza can score 40 and beat us. And if he can't, well, we're not going to let everyone else beat us from the three-point line. And that's what Indiana did. And, in another world, if Iowa makes 10 of 23 threes, obviously it's a different game, but I think that's the gamble you have to take to beat Iowa.
Yeah, Indiana had an example of that last year when they played Iowa in Assembly Hall. I think Garza went for 38 and Indiana still won. So it's not, as you mentioned, about shutting down Garza, because that's not going to happen. He's still got 28. I do think there's some significance in the fact that last night he needed 22 shots and 9 free throw attempts to get to 28. That's, I think, about, in terms of doing a decent job on him, I mean, that's pretty good that he needed to take that many shots, given how efficient he typically is. You mentioned being a little less optimistic on Iowa than others, and I would put myself kind of right in that same category, because I feel like every year with Iowa we get to this same point, maybe not to this degree where they're ranked this high, but there's been examples. You go back to the year, I think Jared Uhoff was on the team. I think they got to a top 5 ranking around a similar point in the season. And they've had other teams where you looked at them and you're like, well, they're a contender to win the Big Ten. And Franz never made the Sweet 16 at Iowa. Do you think this is another situation where we're going to look back in a couple of months and say they still haven't figured out the defensive thing and they're going to be susceptible to an early upset in the tournament? Because, I look at last night, Indiana was playing terribly coming into the game. I mean, they just got completely dismantled basically for the first time all season against Purdue. They only lost by 12, but it really didn't feel like it was that close. They weren't playing particularly well, and they come right into Iowa and figure out a way to win. It just, to me, it raises some red flags about Iowa's ability maybe to kind of do more down the stretch of the season than what most people think they can do.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those situations where you're gonna have to show me before I'm really gonna believe in Iowa. They're truly the best offensive team in the country, and they're capable of just running a team out of the gym if they get hot for even 5 or 10 minutes in a game, right? So that gives them an incredible upside, but I haven't seen anything to make me think, oh, they figured it out on defense. I mean, right now they're ranked 8th in the Big Ten in defensive efficiency, but they haven't played any of the good offensive teams in the Big Ten. I had this stat on my podcast earlier this week. Their first 7 games were all against Big Ten teams in the bottom half of the offensive efficiency standings in the league. So that's a scary number, because that means you're going to play the better offensive teams and you're already a average to below average defense. So that's not championship caliber. Is it possible to win a Big Ten playing like that? I mean, it is. We saw Michigan do it in 2014. That team was pretty much around the same spot where they were so prolific offensively, they would just shoot teams out of games. But I also think that there's some really solid teams, and there's a lot of work left to do on the back half of the schedule for Iowa. They still have to play Illinois, Wisconsin twice. They have to go to Michigan. So we're going to see a lot, and those teams are all capable of putting together an effective game plan against this Iowa defense that's last in the Big Ten in 3-point volume allowed and last in the Big Ten in assisted field goals. So the calendar's rolling toward February, and this is kind of Fran McCaffrey season, so it's hard not to say, well, maybe. And after watching that game last night, it becomes even easier to say that.
I want to get into Michigan briefly before we get to the top 25. Should we call it a top 25 debacle? Although I will say, when you mentioned earlier that we didn't do a very good job, I think we did have a season where Nick Stauskas won Big Ten Player of the Year and we didn't have him in the top 25. So that's got to be, or maybe it was Keita Bates-Diop. One of those.
Bates-Diop, we missed badly on.
Okay. But Michigan, I watched their game against Minnesota. To me, it wasn't that alarming because, one, you're not going to win every game, right? I mean, there was no scenario in which Michigan was just going to continue to mow teams down in the Big Ten. They were playing at a really high level. Minnesota's really good at home. They've got 2, top 25 players, obviously, in Marcus Carr and Liam Robbins. And so I chalked it up to, Michigan had a bad day, and I think Eli Brooks was out that game. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. Then they bounced back and beat Maryland. To me, Michigan's the best team right now in the Big Ten, but when are we going to start to learn more maybe about what this team's ceiling is ultimately? Their schedule coming up, I think it's a little bit tougher. I mean, that was the knock early in the season was, well, they didn't play anybody in the non-conference, and then they played some better games, most notably Wisconsin, and completely crushed them, and I think that was out the window. So just in general, where is this Michigan team at right now, and what do you still need to see and learn about them to kind of figure out what the ultimate ceiling for this group is?
Yeah, Michigan's schedule, like everything that's been said about Michigan's schedule is pretty fair. They had a gradual ramp up into the season in the non-conference where they played. It's a pretty shrewd schedule overall where they actually played some decent MAC teams instead of like 300 level teams, but they also didn't play any real like high major teams, right? So it was a cautious schedule, but it's actually paid out as far as like rankings and stuff like that, because a couple teams they played have turned out to be decent. But their schedule is very backloaded, and not even like the next couple weeks. It's really the last 3 weeks of the season where they start playing all of their tough games. So we are going to learn more, but it's still going to take until February, I think, because Michigan still has to play Illinois, Wisconsin again, and Iowa, and all those games are in the last month of the season. So I think the key for Michigan is to say, okay, the next lesson is, can we go on the road and can we beat teams like Purdue, Minnesota, Northwestern? Obviously, they lost that Minnesota game. Eli Brooks, you look at Michigan's roster and you'd say he's probably the fifth most important starter, but his value to what this team does on defense and offense really goes beyond the stat sheet, where he has the experience to be kind of the primary perimeter defender, but also just helps the ball move offensively and makes everyone around him better, even without just touching the ball almost. So he's a key loss, and it sounds like one of those things where if you didn't see the game, you'd say that can't really be the difference, but he does make that kind of difference for Michigan. So he was back against Maryland. You're not going to take much from just watching Michigan win another game by 15, 20 points, but it's what they're doing, and I think that does say that, okay, this team is good enough to do that. I'm really curious to see how some of these upcoming games come, because now you're going to play teams like Purdue, teams like Indiana that are good enough to make the NCAA tournament. And really Michigan's only played Wisconsin and Minnesota, who are NCAA tournament likely teams, I would say. So there's more tests coming up, and I'm really curious to see how Michigan fares against some of those maybe like 5th to 8th ranked teams in the Big Ten.
They're the only Big Ten team right now, I'll point out, that's in the top 10. Actually, they're both in the top 8 of both of Ken Palm's adjusted defensive and offensive efficiency. It's a pretty good barometer of, Iowa you look at and you say, well, they got the number one defense, but they got the 90th ranked, or number one ranked offense, 90th ranked defense. Michigan's balance, I think, really kind of stands out when you look at just the versatility that they have, particularly on the wings defensively, with Isaiah Livers and Franz, and then Hunter Dickinson in the paint. Mike Smith has been one of the best graduate transfer pickups, not only in the Big Ten, but in the country. So, say what you want about the schedule, but Michigan's beaten enough teams now convincingly for me to just kind of look at them and say, they're the best team in the Big Ten right now. Could it change when they start playing tougher games down the stretch? Other teams capable of winning the Big Ten still? Yes, but right now I look at it as a situation where if Michigan keeps executing, playing like they have to be viewed as the favorite in the Big Ten. Yeah,
and the one stat I would add that really speaks to sort of Michigan's sustainability is that they're top 10 in 2-point defense and 2-point offense in the country. Yeah. And that just is how they win games. They are bigger and more athletic and just dominate the paint. And then from there, the rest of the game kind of falls into place. So Hunter Dickinson's impact in the middle and his ability to just control that area of the court has opened everything up for the rest of Michigan's offense. And I think that's a lot more sustainable than maybe an offense that if we were looking and say, oh, well, Michigan's shooting 45% from three and they're winning all these games because of their 3-point shooting. No, it's actually that they've just been bigger and tougher inside than every team they've played. And that, to me, bodes well for the future as far as sustainability. but maybe it's just they've played a bunch of teams that aren't tough inside. So that's what to watch for, but that's what makes this team stand out at this point.
Hey, it's Jared. I'm going to jump in here real quick to talk about Home Field Apparel, our friends at homefieldapparel.com. And there are several reasons why you need to go to homefieldapparel.com to upgrade your Indiana University sports wardrobe. Number one, all of their materials are so comfortable. I have the hoodies. I have a crew neck sweatshirt. I just received my LEO t-shirt that they have. And all of the materials are so soft. It feels so good against your body. And what's nice is that they still feel soft even after you wash them. Because a lot of materials, you get them, you wash them, they don't feel as nice. Home Field Apparel stuff really does. So you can count on that. Plus, they have logos there that you're not going to find anywhere else. That's kind of their thing. You know, they have over 90 different schools that they work with now. They go and find these old brand marks and logos and mascots that, you know, haven't been used in 40, 50 years, sometimes longer, and they bring them back. And so it's this great way to indulge your love of nostalgia, find these old logos that you haven't seen. And so when you go there, you'll be able to browse. I mean, for Indiana stuff, they have, 2 pages worth of gear that you can see, stuff on T-shirts, stuff on crew necks, stuff on sweaters, such comfortable stuff. And it's not just IU. You may have people in your life that went to school somewhere else. Sorry for those folks, but, they may have. And you can find so much gear for other schools as well. And even better, you can save when you go there because our promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, will help you save 20% on your entire order. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use that promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, and get 20% off your entire order. All right, back to the show.
We'll get in now to the meat of the podcast here with our top 25 list that we do. I don't know how long we've been doing this, Dylan. I think we started it 4 or 5 years, maybe. Yeah, how long? I think we did
longer.
Wait, if Stauskas was in the Big Ten, when was that?
That was 14.
Okay, so we've been doing it at least probably 7 or 8 years. I think we started it because it was August and we had nothing else to post because July recruiting was over and we needed an idea. So we're like, well, we'll do this list. But anyway, for those unfamiliar, we did it a little later this year because of everything going on with the COVID situation. But we rank the top 25 players in the Big Ten every year, preseason. We get a lot of things right and we get a lot of things wrong. So I thought it'd be interesting just at the halfway point of basically the halfway point of the conference season, maybe a little bit shy of that, given some cancellations and teams getting ready to play their 9th and 10th games. I figure we'll look back at what we got right, what we got wrong. And so I don't know really the best place to start with this, but I'm looking at our top 3 right now, and you can say it was obvious on those 3, but do you have any thing you would do differently right now in that top 3? It feels like, I think there's other guys that you can argue. Luka Garza, Io, and Trace Jackson Davis was how we had 1, 2, and 3. But overall, when you could just kind of look at what those 3 guys have done, I feel like based on the information that we had before the season and kind of what the performance has been so far, we did a pretty decent job at the top.
Yeah, I don't know that if I ranked the top 25 players right now that the top 3 would really even change. Would you change anything?
I wouldn't necessarily change anything, but I wouldn't have a problem if you wanted to make an argument for Hunter Dickinson or Travion Williams, maybe, potentially. Those are the 2 names that I'm looking at right now saying, those guys have been – we had Travion 7th, but he's been better than Micah Potter so far. So he deserves to be ahead of him. The only reason I say that with Michigan, with Hunter is because he's been amazing this season in terms of his impact on Michigan. Now, Michigan's not just a one-man team, and with Indiana, it's a little bit different. Trace is carrying a significant load game in and game out, and he doesn't necessarily have the help that Hunter has in Franz and Isaiah Livers. But those are the 2 guys that those are the 2 guys I would say you could possibly make an argument for, but I wouldn't necessarily change anything in our top 3.
Yeah, for me, it gets interesting after the top 3 because I think those three were pretty locked in before the season. I don't think anything that's happened this year really changes it. We had Kofi Coburn, Franz Wagner, and Micah Potter at 4th through 6th, and that's where I think I would start making some moves. I think I'm probably okay with Kofi around that same spot, but it gets really interesting where you put Hunter Dickinson, who I would point out we didn't even put on our top 25 list, which is a giant swing and a miss. The trouble is with Hunter, I think you can make a case that Michigan has 3 top 10 players in the league, and that makes it really hard to figure out who should be that first team player, right? That top 5 player. I think it's tough because Hunter Dickinson has been Michigan's best player statistically. He really changes what Michigan does. I think you can probably make the case that he belongs in that top 5, but Franz Wagner is also really, really good. He's Michigan's best defender, and he's probably the best pro prospect in the league. So those guys are going to split a lot of votes around that spot, I would say. And I think you can make a fair case for either one. We had Franz at 5th. If I were re-ranking him, I'd probably put Hunter at 5th and Franz at 6th. But I think you can kind of pick your poison there.
Not to go on a tangent real quick, but it's going to be real frustrating, I feel like, when we get these media awards at the end of the season and we don't see guys like Hunter or Kofi or Travion Williams on the first team or right on the fringe of it, just because of how these things are voted on from a position standpoint. I hate that it's.
Will it be? Is it based on positions?
It's not based on positions, but I feel like a lot of people vote that way, right? Like you have some of these old school, and I'm not trying to obviously.
Oh, names of names. Let's make this spicy.
I'm not going to name names, but I guarantee if you look at some ballots, you're going to have Marcus Carr on the first team because he's a point guard. And you can debate whether or not he's deserving. We took a lot of heat in the preseason because we had him 11th. But I'll be real curious. Let me just say that. I'll be curious to see when the season ends how many of the guys that you would consider to be a 4 or 5 end up on the first team, because I think there's an argument to make for several of them, and I won't be shocked if Luka Garza and Trace Jackson Davis, if the season continues the way it is, if those are the only 2 that land first team.
I think Kofi has I think Kofi's the guy who's most likely to fall out because Dosunmu's already going to be on the first team. I think it's rare to see 2 players from the same team on the first team, especially if that team doesn't win the Big Ten. So that was where I would look for the first fallout. But yeah, you can make a real case that there should be 4 centers on the first team. And I feel like that's, I don't know. I know I want to go back and look at the voting, but if the 4 of the 5 best players in the league are bigs, I think you have to give them the votes. You keep hyping up Travion Williams. I'm curious, do you really think he's a first-team All-Big Ten player based on what he's done this year?
I don't know if he's first-team All-Big Ten, but so far I feel like he's been better than 7th. I mean, Purdue is 6-3 right now in the Big Ten. He scored, I look at what he did in that second half against Michigan State. I think he scored 22 or 24 points in the second half against Michigan State. Their season was teetering at that point, I feel like, on the verge of disaster potentially had they lost that game, and they won that game and now have reeled off. I have to pull up their schedule, but I think it's 4 in a row maybe?
4 in a row, yep. 3 away from home.
He's 6th right now in Ken Palm's Player of the Year rankings, second highest usage rate in the country. If I'm reading this right, 55% on 2s, which is pretty good. 9th in the country. Is it 9th in the country in offensive rebounding percentage?
Yeah, and I get all that. He also shoots. What does he shoot at the line? 48%. I mean,
I'm not saying I would put him on the first team for sure. I'm saying that I think if I'm redoing the list, maybe he's still 7th. I think he's definitely been better than Micah Potter for sure, no question. Yes, right. Micah
Potter is one of my biggest drops, but I don't know. I would put Marcus Carr ahead of Travion Williams, I think.
Okay.
And
I wouldn't have a problem with that.
I would leave Franz Wagner ahead of him. So that actually like I come up with Travion coming in at 8, not so actually a step
behind
down.
Behind Hunter, right?
Yeah, I would put Hunter and Carr above Travion. So that gives you like a top 7 of Garza, Dosunmu, Trace, Coburn, Dickinson, Wagner, Carr, and then Travion. I think that's probably the best 8 players in the Big Ten, but I can't get Travion much further just because of his efficiency. I previewed Purdue today, so I had a graphic in my preview of kind of the post-up scores in the Big Ten, and Travion is way up in usage, but he's far less efficient than basically all these other guys who are extremely efficient, and that's what kind of makes them special. Williams is really a usage thing, and that's because that's what Purdue needs, and he's getting the job done. They're winning games, but I just don't see it completely, but that's where I'm at with him as a second teamer.
I'm good with that for the top 8. After that, where do we make the next biggest mistake? Here's the thing. In the Michigan State guys, we had Aaron Henry 9th. We had Rocket Watts 13th, and we had Joey Hauser 14th. Michigan State hasn't played in I don't know how long now, but it's at least a week, and we don't know when they're going to play again. They weren't good before they got shut down. We don't really know what they're going to be after they come back. And Rocket Watts has been one of the biggest disappointments in the Big Ten, and the other 2 guys, have been. I don't know how you follow Michigan State a little bit closer than I do, but I think one of the big reasons that Michigan State is underwhelmed is those 3 players haven't been as good as everybody thought going into the season. So I'll look at Aaron Henry at 9th and say we missed so far based on what's happened.
Yeah, my preseason Rocket Watts take was that he'd be a top 10 player or a bottom 10 player, and he's much closer to a bottom 10 player. He's been outright bad this year. He just hasn't found his niche. So I think he drops out. It's just funny because we were trying to
the top 25 completely, right?
Yeah, I don't know how you could say he's a top 25 player in the Big Ten right now. He's been benched. He can't find himself, and he has talent. He's just not an efficient college basketball player right now. Joey Hauser, also, I think we are too high on. He looks banged up a little bit, but he just hasn't found it consistently at the type of production that people around that program were touting in the preseason. I think Aaron Henry is I think you can make a case Watts and Hauser are not top 25 players in the Big Ten right now based on everything we've seen.
I feel like Quinn talked us into Hauser a little bit, but I remember our preseason discussions, though, on Hauser, and I looked at what he did at Marquette as a freshman. He was like the 3rd or 4th best player on Marquette. He shot a lot of threes and made a lot, but he was playing with Marcus Howard and his brother Sam. And his role wasn't he wasn't a featured player on that Marquette team. He left, transferred, sat out a year. You only ever hear good things about players who are sitting out a transfer year because the positivity coming out from the program is, well, if we had this guy this year, he could really help, he could do this or that. This is the missing piece.
To be fair, I think Hauser would have been a terror if he played on last year's Michigan State team. He was exactly what that team needed.
Exactly, but that's my whole point. He was on Marquette and put up good, efficient numbers because he was surrounded by other good players. He would have done the same thing last year with Cassius Winston and Xavier Tillman. Those are 2 NBA players. Those are 2 arguably 5 or 6 best players in the league. He would have been a good complementary piece and a highly efficient. Now he's being asked to play a more a bigger role.
I don't even know what he's being asked to do right now. It's kind of a mess altogether.
Exactly. But he's not 14th right now based on what he's done. So
double figures in one Big Ten game. That kind of says it all. I think Hauser's out. I think Aaron Henry is still a top 25 player. I think he's probably in the lower teens right now, just based on how he's played. He has the talent, and I really think I think you would probably buy low on Aaron Henry right now. I think if Michigan State does anything over the next 2 months, it's going to be through Aaron Henry. So I'm buying into him as far as what could come, but right now he's not a top 10 player based on what we've seen, because it's just funny when you look at all these players in a vacuum in the summer, you just think about what they do individually, their talent. But when you look at them in the middle of the season, it's very clear man, you better win some games if you want to be considered one of the best players in the league. And Michigan State isn't winning games right now, and it's just hard to put someone like Henry this high on the list.
Well, that's the whole reason we had 3 Michigan State players in the top 14, because we picked them to finish in the top 3 or 4. Most people did in the preseason, probably 4th. But still, there was a trust factor with Izzo, and we completely glanced over the fact that they don't have a point guard and they don't have a center, right? And so Hauser was always going to need a big man that could do things to kind of take some of the pressure off of him. And Michigan State doesn't have a 5. I mean, so that to me, coupled with the fact that they're now starting a freshman who has no business really starting in the Big Ten right now at point guard because Rocket Watts couldn't do the job effectively, is basically the story of Michigan State's season. But so kind of to recap what we had, so we had Travion 7th, Livers 8th. We haven't really talked about Livers, but I think Livers and Wieskamp are kind of right in the range of probably where they should have been. Like, you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I would keep Livers around that same point. I think he's 9th or 10th probably in the league, somewhere in that range.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious. And Wieskamp, I tried to re-rank it, and I dropped him a couple spots, but that was mostly just because I wanted to hype up other people. The guy I would put 10th right now, I mean, this might be a hot take, but Demetric Trice. I think he's playing like the second best, third best, second best, however you want to classify Dosunmu, but point guard in the Big Ten. Wisconsin's really good. He's had some monster games. I think he makes that team dynamic and really fits in. So I bumped him way up. We had him further down, like probably like 16 or 17. So
that's now that he's 25 years old, he's finally hitting his stride in the Big Ten. How old is he really? Seriously, I think he's 24.
I think he's 24. Like he's going to turn 25 soon, I believe.
Which is check. Nothing against him. I mean,
he's 24.7 years old.
So could he come back next year?
He could come back next year.
So he could be a 26-year-old Big Ten player.
Well,
next season, right?
He will be almost 26 by the time the season ended.
He made some clutch shots against Indiana in that game. He was the reason they won that game in Madison, because without him, I think Indiana would have been able to win that game. So yeah, I like Trice. He's, considering that Potter has been a disappointment and Nate Reavers, I think that's how we say it.
Reavers. I'm picking out of the entire top 25.
He's completely disappeared. He's broken at this point. I don't know.
I think we both were down on him in the preseason a little bit, but we still ranked him like 12th.
I mean, his stats were pretty good in conference play last year. Like, they won the Big Ten. He was reliable. I mean, he wasn't. I feel like I was high on him as a kind of a breakout guy going into his sophomore and junior year. And then he just never really took that next step. And this year he's just regressed.
He looks completely
he's like unplayable at times. I mean, we talked in the preseason about how can Wisconsin figure out a way to play these two together, and now it's becoming clear that they're not going to be able to do that with any consistency.
I mean, they benched him at Rutgers, so he's come off the bench the last 2 games, played 17 minutes, 22 minutes. I almost think that's too much. Like, he's 1 of 14 from 3 in Big Ten games. His block rates numbers are way down. He's not the same player, and I think Micah Potter still has all that offensive upside, so I think you need to just keep playing Micah Potter because that's going to make Wisconsin the best team. So Reavers is he's just kind of lost in space for me right now. So he's one of probably the biggest drops that we have on the list, I would say.
So we're getting kind of to the part of the list in the middle of the pack where I feel like some of these guys that we completely left off the list might start to fit in. So I'm curious. Here are some of the names that I just jotted down and that we didn't have on the list that I feel like belongs somewhere. We already went through Hunter Dickinson. We'd have him higher up. But Pete Nance of Northwestern, I feel like, is going to be on there somewhere. I don't know if he's in this range. E.J. Liddell, who we got burned by last year. We were a year early on him, but I feel like he's somewhere in this mix.
I think he's a top 15 player.
Dwayne Washington is somewhere in the top 25. Agree?
Yeah, I mean, to our credit, I think before the season, we were like, man, Ohio State has a lot of guys. It's hard to pick who's best. And we picked the wrong one. We picked wrong. We had Justice Suing and Seth Towns in the top 25, and that was not right.
To be fair to us on Seth Towns, though, we had no idea what
we could have known that he was going to be hurt. He'd been hurt for almost as long as we've been doing the list.
We did. We knew that, but we also – it's not like he was a non-contributor at his previous stop. I mean, he was the Ivy League Player of the Year.
Talent.
Right. He's just not the player that he once was. And I mean, didn't Duke and some other higher level schools want him? So it wasn't like he was completely off the radar. So, and that was a miss. But yeah, I think we missed Liddell, we missed Washington. But in fairness to us, it was Ohio State was always going to be tough to pick.
Now that we know what Ohio State is, Liddell is probably the best player on Ohio State, right? I think he's the guy you would put in the top 15, and Washington's probably the top 25 guy. That's how I would grade them out right now. Washington has been shooting really well this year, despite the fact that I feel like he almost never takes good shots. So you have to give him a little credit for that. And to be fair, with CJ Walker out, he's really the only guard on the team. So he has to take a lot of bad shots. And he's been shockingly efficient for a bad shot taker. So I think he's probably, I would even say, a top 20 guy. So those are the two guys on Ohio State that we missed pretty badly on. I agree with that. Is that where you put him?
Yeah, I mean, at some point you have to get credit for winning, right? And Ohio State, regardless of what you think about them as a team, they're 11-4 overall. They're 17th in KenPom. Is it sustainable? Do I think maybe a regression's coming later in the season? I'm not convinced that Ohio State is that good, but at some point you are what your record says, and they deserve some credit. I don't think they're this good without those two guys playing as well as they have. So those two, I think, are definitely deserving of top 20 spots. And Liddell, to me, I think if I was making all Big Ten teams right now, I think you'd be third team.
I think that's right.
That's fair. The other guys I had jotted down, the only other guy, you mentioned two others. I can let you talk about them maybe at all, but I had Dante Scott, however you want to say it, from Maryland. I think he's got to be in there somewhere too, right?
He's probably the most improved player in the Big Ten, I'd say. Like, I don't know if Maryland would have won a Big Ten game without what he's done. His three-point shooting, his ability to finish, he's really the only truly dynamic player on that team, I feel like, and that's really hard to guard. So I think he has got to be in there. Pete Nance is another one I think you mentioned, who's obviously very improved. I feel like some of the flash in the pan, I feel like by the end of the year, his numbers probably aren't going to be quite as impressive as we thought they were early when he was really hot from three. He's got he's fine. I just don't know that he's like an all Big Ten type guy. He's more in that.
He's probably he's probably like 21 to 25 range right now. But the thing is, if Northwestern can't win any more games, then all of a sudden his kind of the reasons that we liked him, which was because he was playing well and Northwestern was winning, all of a sudden get thrown out the window. And
exactly.
It's hard to reward a guy on they're 3-6 right now. I think they've lost 6 in a row. So we'll see kind of, what happens there. I think the other two guys you mentioned to me earlier when we were talking before, Andre Curbelo and Sasha Stefanovic, as potential additions. But I want to go from so we talked about Rocket Watson, Hauser, Ron Harper Jr. We had at 15. I feel like he's in the top 15. Maybe
I feel like he's probably a month ago. I would have said he's too low. But whatever's happening in Piscataway is not going in the right direction, and I think he's probably a third-team All-Big Ten guy right now. There's just not enough there to really move him up over. If you I would take EJ Liddell over him. I'd take Wieskamp. I'd take Micah Potter. I don't think Rutgers is relevant enough to bump him up that far. So I think we actually got him right on the nose. Geo Baker, we had a couple spots below him, and even we thought that was low compared to conventional wisdom or whatever, but man, he needs to drop even further.
He's not on the list right now.
No, he's not
making
on the list.
And before the season, I told you I thought it was a joke that he was showing up on some of these lists as like a top 10 point guard or a top 10 top 10. He was on a top 10 returning players in college basketball list in the preseason by a prominent reporter. So I'm not going to mention by name.
All Big Ten too, right?
Right. He's shooting 25% on threes. He's shooting 46.2% on twos for the season. His offensive rating is horrible. I mean, he's not top 25 at this point. So not saying he can't turn around, not saying that he can't make clutch shots because he's done it before. But I mean, I'm looking at the complete body of work, and I'm just saying at this point, he's not really relevant in terms of this discussion. So
can we just take a moment here? The preseason All Big Ten team had 10 players.
Yeah.
Two of those 10 players were Geo Baker and Nate Reuvers. Franz Wagner was not on the team, and that's just
I called
crazy
that out.
to me.
I remember calling that out too when it came out.
Yeah, like Franz Wagner is improved this year and whatever else, but it was pretty obvious that he was going to be really good this year. We had him 5th on our list for a while. It was crazy to me that he didn't make a 10-man All Big Ten team. And between Reuvers, Baker, and Aaron Henry, those are the 3 spots in sort of the all preseason All Big Ten.
Didn't Potter also not make it?
Potter also wasn't on the team.
So that see, this kind of goes back to my point though earlier about the voting on this stuff. How could anybody who watched Big Ten basketball last season vote Nate Reuvers over Micah Potter coming into the season when you know the reason? If you paid attention, the reason that Wisconsin won the Big Ten last year wasn't because of Nate Reuvers. It was because Micah Potter became eligible, and they won a ton of games down the stretch because of how good of a player he was, particularly scoring around the basket. I mean so that's why it's like.
I just think you're giving people too much credit to say they vote by position. I think there's just some dumb voters. That's what I'll put it out there.
Okay. Well, however you want to say it, it was bad. Okay, so moving on down. Marion Jones, I mean, we had him 16th. I feel like we almost had to throw somebody on there from Penn State, but isn't Isaiah Brockington been better than him this year for the most part?
Yeah, I mean, Jones has been solid. They have Penn State's thing is just play 4 point guards and see what happens. Basically, 4 guys that can break you down off the dribble. So I think Jones is a fine pick. I mean, he'd probably drop a few spots because there's guys who have played better, but I think he's probably a top 25-ish guy.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the guys we have after him. We have Geo, who we just talked about. Eric Hunter has been not very good this year. I don't think he would be on the list based on how he's played. Suing, Seth Towns, Bohannon. We did argue over what Iowa guy. We picked the right guy. Bohannon's been really good this year shooting. Christian Lander, terrible pick. Adam Miller, wrong Illinois freshman. We should have picked Capello. I think he's had a bigger impact. And then Liam Robbins at 25, I think we would bump him up into the top 20 if we re-rank the list right now.
Yeah, so let's talk about a couple of those guys. Lander, 23.
Oof.
All right,
tell me what happened there.
I don't know what happened. I'm still trying to figure it out. Last night was interesting in that he didn't play. Like, he usually comes in for about a 2 to 3 minute stint in the first half and then never comes back off the bench. Last night was the opposite, where they actually played him a little bit down the stretch. He didn't do anything in terms of the stat sheet, but he
almost turned it over twice, I feel like.
Right. He held his own. Like, it wasn't like for him at this point, like, a win is not coming in and completely screwing up. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the kid, but, the thing that I thought about before the season, and I mentioned this to you, was how hard it is for a point guard to class up and come in and play in the Big Ten. He was ranked as a top 25 player in the country. So we obviously use that as somewhat of a guide to try to figure out the impact of a player, but we have no idea how a guy's going to integrate into a team. And to me, the clear thing is he's not ready to play. I don't know if it means he's never going to be a good player, because I don't necessarily believe that at this point. It just means for this point in time of this season, he's not a relevant player on Indiana's team. He's probably their 10th or 11th man, and his inclusion on this list was the absolute worst pick probably of anybody. And so, I mean, that's really all there is to say about it. I mean, I hope for the kid's sake that, he's able to turn around and have a good career, but right now he's just he just seems lost to me and virtually unplayable at times.
I think it's important. Like, it's one of those things where we talked about the reason not to rank him, and we still ranked him. So I also think you have to keep that in perspective to say, all right, he's not ready to play. He doesn't change what he is as a prospect. If he was putting up 20 points and 10 assists in high school right now, that wouldn't, like, he's still the same guy, right? So the fact that he's not ready to play college basketball when he should be in high school doesn't tell me that much. I think we've seen it. It's hard to play point guard as a freshman when you're a normal age. Like Seb Jackson at Michigan, he looks completely not ready to play whenever he's on the court. That's just because he hasn't had the reps and just isn't at that level of, like, the amount of readiness and understanding of the game you have to be able to play at this level, especially at point guard, is really hard to grasp for a kid in high school. So I don't think you should just sell all your Christian Lander stock and say he's never going to be good. He clearly still has all the same tools he had. So I wouldn't give up on that. He's just not ready right now. I mean, he's 1 of 10 from 2 on the whole year. That's hard to do. I'm
definitely not giving up on him as a prospect long term. I'm just saying for this particular season. And one thing I think is important to point out in this particular season that's maybe relevant to other seasons is that there was really no ramp up time for these younger guys to kind of get thrown into the fire. I mean, Indiana's schedule in the non-conference was ambitious, I think. I mean, they played those 2 terrible teams, North Alabama and Tennessee Tech, but really, in a typical season, you've got from late November until early November until beginning of January before, the meat of the conference schedule picks up. It was different this year. They didn't have opportunities. They needed to win as many games as possible, just given the circumstances of Archie's tenure and the fact that he needs to make the tournament this year. And so there wasn't an opportunity to just throw the guy in there and say, learn on the job. And that was never going to happen. So we'll see. I mean, I think he's got all the talent in the world, and I think he can be a productive player, potentially an all Big Ten player down the line, just for this particular season.
How many freshmen across the country are playing well right now? Not many, right? All the teams, like so many teams.
Look at Kentucky's team. I mean, it's like Kentucky. Everybody's. I mean, Kentucky's like 4-9, and they had a guy who was projected by most to be a top 10 pick, basically getting criticized by their fan base every game for being a bust. I mean, it's the product in many ways. I think maybe this class isn't as good as people thought, and also it's a different season. I mean, I think the thing in this college basketball season that's ultimately going to be rewarded is the teams that have the most experience and the teams who kind of had some level of cohesion going back to last season. I mean, even you look at Michigan, they've integrated new guys, but they had a foundation with Franz and Isaiah Livers.
Mm-hmm. And what I would say about Michigan is it's one thing to integrate Mike Smith and Shawnee Brown, who it's basically like almost forming a G League team at that point, right? Like, these guys are ready they're the kind of guys that could go play in Europe right now and would know how to fit into a team, right? They've played hundreds of college basketball games. They know the drill. They haven't played on winning teams, but they've been through this, right? They know what it takes.
Yeah, it's not their fault they've been playing winning teams. It's their circumstances.
So it's a lot easier to install an offense when you've got 24-year-old dudes that are like, okay, I've been here, I've done this, I know what's going on. And you have one freshman, like Hunter Dickinson, maybe to fit in. It's another thing to build a whole team around freshmen in an offseason that's been all sorts of weird, has been limited, not as much on-court time. That's what's so hard, I think, is that offseason time is really key for these freshmen who have to learn how to play college basketball. And that's a huge leap. And Michigan going to the transfer market has basically hit 2 home runs with Brown and Smith. And that has really changed them as far as just what they can be in a cohesive product on the court where everyone has a role. And that's hard to come by as a freshman. So I think that's definitely a huge factor across college basketball. And you can really see it if you just look down who's playing well and who's really struggling.
So of our guys so we said throw Baker out, he was 18th. Eric Hunter, he's not in, right?
Can't be in, I don't think. He's not been, I mean, Purdue's getting a lot from their freshmen in the backcourt in spots, but Hunter's kind of struggled. He's been far less efficient than he has been. I think he's still a good player. I think the injury probably took him off track a little bit, but he hasn't played well this year, I would say.
Stewing's out. Towns is out. Bohannon's got to be in, right?
Yeah, Bohannon's I think he's probably in the right area.
Lander's out. Miller's out. Curbelo's in, right?
I would go Curbelo over Miller. Like, I know like some of the numbers are a bit ugly, but they're both like Miller's not an awful pick as far as he's starting for a team that's contending in the Big Ten. He just hasn't quite been the impact we might have hoped.
I just feel like Curbelo's more impactful.
Yeah, Curbelo in like 1 or 2 years is going to be so fun to watch. Like, he's going to steal the show in the Big Ten, I feel. I think you can just see his feel and his playmaking feel and passing. I'm like really excited about his future. The problem right now is he makes an amazing assist half the time and then just throws the ball to the other team half the time. That's what he's got to clean up. But he's got that flair to his game that I think is going to be really fun. So I'm all in on Curbelo.
And so Robbins is in too. Is there anybody else? Those are the names I mentioned earlier.
Did we say Sasa Stefanovic? I think he's got to be in.
Yeah.
Boo Booey maybe.
Yeah. Is there anybody else from Minnesota besides Carr and Robbins? No, I wouldn't.
Gotch, but I'm not putting Gotch on my team. I mean, Minnesota's probably one of the most dependent teams on two specific players in the entire conference, I'd say.
What about before he got hurt? Would Armand Franklin have a chance to be at the bottom of the top 25?
Sure. I mean, I think you. Yeah,
I'm not saying he deserves to be in there, but he was solid. I feel like going into, that he had the stretch, I think, where he was averaging like 17 or 18 in the Big Ten. So I think at least he would be in the conversation.
I think
the last spots.
I think that's right.
I'm trying to think any other teams that we didn't. I mean, Nebraska's obviously a no. I mean, Teddy Allen, he's averaging stats, but it's like, what does it mean if you're losing our games? Anybody else on Maryland?
I'm not putting anyone else on Maryland. Rutgers, Jacob Young from Rutgers maybe would have had a case. He was one of those kind of early season stories. I honestly think I could see Penn State finishing ahead of teams like Northwestern and Rutgers right now. So I would keep an eye on some. Like, I would see some of their guards being like in
Brockington,
Sam Sessoms, Brockington, like those guys have some game. There's just too many of them.
Yeah,
it's a weird phenomenon where the teams that have been somewhat consistent and like, because I think there's probably 8 teams you would say are a good bet to make the NCAA tournament right now, where Indiana and Minnesota are those 7th and 8th teams.
Yeah,
it's everyone from that point up has pretty established go-to guys, and you get to about 20 when you include most of those guys, but you really got to plug your nose to take someone from Michigan State, Rutgers, Northwestern, Maryland, Penn State, or Nebraska at this point. Like, do you think any of those bottom half teams, maybe, like, I think you probably set the over-under at a half for one of those teams to make the tournament right now, right? And it'd probably be Michigan State, but, man, they got work to do.
So are we saying on Michigan State the only guy that we would have in the top 25 is Aaron Henry? Right now?
Who? I want to say yes. I think if you actually
go
by
through,
the end of the season, Hauser might be like 25th.
What's that? Hauser?
I think Hauser slides in by the end of the season. But Michigan State plays so many guys, and no one's playing particularly well. Like, that doesn't lead to top 25 players.
Yeah. I don't know what to make of Michigan State. I have no idea. Indiana plays them, scheduled to play them twice. One of them is a makeup game. I thought to myself, if Indiana's going to make the tournament, their games against Michigan State and Rutgers, they play those two teams 4 times the rest of the way. They're going to have to at least split, maybe win 3 of those to get in. So
yeah, I mean, you look at Michigan State, they win that game. They completely botched the game against Purdue. And then now they're shut down for COVID for almost 3 weeks, basically. They're supposed to come back at Rutgers.
And at Ohio State.
What's that?
Right? It's at Rutgers and then at Ohio State.
Yeah, exactly. But Rutgers could be coming off a 6-game losing streak if they lose at Indiana and basically playing for anything left in their season. And if Michigan State loses that game, the math just gets pretty tough. I mean, they have a lot of tough games left. I don't know. There's obviously opportunities to win, but if they lose that Rutgers game and they're going to be playing, I assume, stuffing games in and all these, any semblance of rest. So I don't know, man. Michigan State is hard to buy stock in right now.
Are we sure, though, that they're actually going to be stuffing games in at this point? I know you talked about this a little bit on the moving screen pod, but I'm starting to wonder how many teams are actually going to play 20 games in the Big Ten, because I don't think it's going to be a very high number. I mean, if they're not going to start making up games this week, I don't necessarily see how all this fits in. And also, with Michigan State, I feel like they're a team that could probably stand to benefit a lot by playing the conference tournament if they could go there and win a couple games, but we don't know what that's going to look like either at this point.
Yeah, so Michigan State will be interesting because they'll have incentive to add games, right? They're going to need games because they're going to need wins.
Yeah, but their opponents also have to say, well, we'll play you at this time, right? It's like the Big Ten, this is where it's going to get into a tug of war between the league and certain teams, because I don't necessarily think that teams that had to cancel games against programs that were shut down for COVID are going to be as what's the right word to say? I'm not saying that they're not going to want to play the games, but they're not going to want to
play on short rest.
Right. The Big Ten shouldn't force a team to play. If they've already got 2 or 3 games scheduled in a week, they shouldn't force a team like, for example, Indiana or Michigan or whoever to play an extra game when it was of no fault of their own. So that to me is where it's going to get interesting.
Yeah,
I think the responsibility comes on, Michigan State to find a date and other teams to find a date that worked with the other team. I don't think the teams that didn't have shutdowns should be forced to play on short rest because somebody else got shut down. That's what I'm saying.
My first question is, do Big Ten teams really have a say, right? Like if the league says you're playing, I think you're playing. Second, especially, I mean, there's politics involved, but I don't know. Like I think. Well, I think
if anybody's going to impose their will on it, it's going to be Izzo, right? He has the most say of any.
Exactly. So if Michigan State wants its game scheduled between Izzo, Kevin Paga, and how everything works, I think that Michigan State's getting its game scheduled. I'm just putting that out there. Second, I think the Big Ten needs to look seriously at bringing games from the future into this next bye week coming up this week so that you can fit more games in later. I use Michigan and Iowa as an example. They're both about to have a week off. They're supposed to play each other on March 4th. Why don't you move that game, play it this week, and then you have an opening for both teams when they need to get games in, because both teams still have games that haven't been rescheduled. If you're going to have these collapsible buys, why not move some games up when you're already knowing you're going to have to make games up? So, I mean, that would have to happen sooner than later. But at this point, why not?
Michigan and Iowa want to do that?
It's criminal to have 2 healthy teams sit on the sidelines for a week. You need to be playing these games. It was crazy when Michigan played 2 games over a 21-day period in December, and it's crazy to, like, if you're going to have these buys, I think it makes sense to use them ahead of time. And I don't know if they will or what, but, man, that would make a lot of sense to me.
Well, I mean, it needs to start happening. Like, I agree with you. It needs to start happening as soon as possible, because the other thing you got to think about is we have no idea what's going to happen with the pandemic. And I know in Indiana specifically, I think it's around February 8th to 10th, somewhere. Don't quote me on that, but I know it's sometime early February. You're going to have students and more people coming back on campus. And so this is kind of the time to like get these as many games in as possible, I feel like. So we'll see. I mean, I still think like a month from now, we're going to be having a huge conversation too about the conference tournaments and how terrible of an idea it is, because the Big Ten specifically, if you're already going to have 8 or 9 teams make it, why would you risk infecting like 2 or 3 of your programs and getting them shut down and not being able to play in the tournament? Because I think it's very possible that happens. Because there's been no like buffer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why the NCAA was like so like dead set on these dates for the tournament. Like, what would have been the issue with pushing it back 10 or 14 days if you want to play conference tournaments?
Yeah, really, just come up with a bigger gap between Selection Sunday and when the games start in Indianapolis. They have all the flexibility in the world. I don't know why you don't do that. It doesn't make sense to me. The Big Ten has been talking about, there's been rumors about moving the tournament to Indianapolis. I wonder if you can come up with some kind of idea of you bubble up for that whole time. What if you just play the Thursday games?
Do you want Nebraska to come into the bubble? What do they have? What do they have to gain? Like,
exactly, they're going to be going out. They're going to be at the slippery noodle. It's an insult
to the players who have done things right for the whole season. I'm not saying specifically Nebraska is going to go there and break protocol, but I'm saying that teams that have nothing to play for, essentially at that point, you would be naive to think that those players are going to be approaching it the same as a Michigan player or an Indiana player or any other team that's going to have a chance to play in the tournament. That's why I'm saying, if you're going to do it, if you're going to play the conference tournament, then bring the teams that actually have a chance to make the tournament and are going to be serious about, I understand that, well, you got to give everybody a chance. A team can go on a run, but this is not a normal year. And I don't think this is a time to take any chances. So
what if you just play the conference tournament with the teams who aren't in line to make the tournament? You just, the top 7 teams opt out or something, and then the bottom 7 teams.
Or give teams a chance to opt out if they don't want to play.
Yeah, I think teams are going to have to seriously consider it. And once one team does that, I would think everyone else will. Because then at that point, the whole conference tournament is tainted. What's the point?
So what's the upside for Michigan or Iowa to play in the Big Ten tournament?
There's no upside. I mean, we talk like it's always a talking point, and maybe that's wrong, but it's better to lose on Friday in the Big Ten tournaments. You can get rest and get ready for the NCAA tournament. This takes that to the extreme where you're talking about
for you to not running a risk so you don't get COVID,
ending the entire season because you have a COVID outbreak that costs you the NCAA tournament.
Especially when the Big Ten is requiring 17 days out for a player, right?
If I'm Michigan, I'm playing Michigan State on March 7th. And I'm taking my team into a hotel in Indianapolis and not letting them leave, right? Like, you have to try to quarantine, and that gives you an effective quarantine period before the NCAA tournament. I don't know. It makes too much sense, and then you look, and it's not at all what's happening. It's going to be weird, and obviously the big X factor is these conference tournaments all have big TV contracts attached to them, and the reason we're playing a season at all is because of TV contracts. So that's what makes sense about the whole thing. So I don't know how it'll play out. It's going to be crazy, but we'll see.
The programs have to look out for themselves, because the bottom line is that if a team gets to a certain point in the tournament and they have COVID, they're not stopping the tournament for that team to rest. The show is going to go on. And I think the worst thing that can happen here is for these players and these coaches who have sacrificed so much this year. And I'm not, in the context of what this country is going through right now, I say sacrifice. I don't mean it literally, but I'm saying everything that they've done this season to kind of be able to play. They've given up so much in their personal lives, not being able to see friends and family with the goal of playing. The worst thing that could happen is that for a team to play the whole season and then all of a sudden get shut down for the tournament, because it's the only reason to play the season, right? I mean, there's nobody cares if you win the Big Ten tournament or the Big Ten regular season title and then you don't get to play the NCAA tournament. I mean, that's the whole goal of this season, period, is to have the tournament. We didn't have it last year. The sport needs to have it. And so whatever we can do to maximize the chances of the tournament going on and have as minimal disruption as possible is what we need to do. So,
yeah, I agree, but we'll see. It's going to be a wild 2 months, I'd say.
I know. Well, Dylan, kept you a little bit longer than originally planned, but it's always fun to talk hoops. I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point. down the stretch here. But everyone, I encourage you to read, subscribe to UMHoops. Dylan not only and his team do a great job of not only covering Michigan, but there's a lot of Big Ten centric stuff on there that's definitely worth your time. And Dylan, once again, thanks for coming on. And everybody, we will be back again next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.